Welcome to the EpicureanFriends.com book review of A Few Days in Athens, a story about Epicurus and Epicurean philosophy. Please keep in mind that A Few Days in Athens is fictional, and the author is giving you her own interpretation of Epicurus. In a few cases, she deviates from Epicurus's own views fairly dramatically, but when we get to those, we'll point them out to you clearly. Even more, keep in mind that the participants you're about to hear are giving their own opinions. There are many different interpretations of Epicurus, and we hope this book review will prompt you to study Epicurus for yourself. For those who want to read more about Epicurus, the book we recommend the most is Norman DeWitt's Epicurus and His Philosophy. We also invite you to join us for discussion at the EpicureanFriends.com forum and to listen to our companion podcast, Lucretius Today, which is available at all major podcast sources. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll enjoy this session, so let's join it now. Thanks, everybody, for being here tonight for the Chapter 15 summary of A Few Days in Athens. It's a very deep chapter with lots of interesting material in it that we can probably go about as deep and as long as we like and still not really hit the material that's in here. It's pretty much as if she's waited till near the end of the book, now that Theon has been introduced to the idea that Epicurus is a little bit more than just a pretty face, I guess is another way to say it. He's now learned that Epicurus is not a traditional theist and doesn't believe in the gods in the same way that everybody else does. And he has come away from his discussion with Epicurus kind of confused about a lot of things. And in this chapter 15, he leaves the company of Epicurus and comes into a situation where he's talking with Metrodorus and Leontium. And what they do is launch into some very high-level observations about the implications of Epicurus's point of view. And what I'll do, like I've always done, is try to hit the high points of what the topics are that are being discussed, and then we can come back and address them in more detail as people are inclined to do so. But every time I read this, I think of different ways to organize it. I don't want to pass over the opening color, where it's kind of interesting, perhaps to those who aren't familiar with the way the different philosophers sniped among themselves. There's an accusation here of Aristotle in particular. For some reason, they choose to focus on him in this chapter as one of the people who's wrong about things. And they accuse him of pedantry, which I wanted to look up to be sure I got exactly the right flavor for what pedantry really means. And the different variations of that word. The first one in Merriam-Webster says one who is unimaginative or who unduly emphasizes minutia in the presentation or use of knowledge. And I suspect that first meaning of the word pedant is what they're primarily hitting on, because there's also something about making a show of knowledge. And I'm sure Kevin is probably, again, with all of this, more familiar than anybody else with it. But it appears that there's a tradition of criticizing Aristotle for the way he presented his material. I put in the notes for tonight, too, that there's a famous saying from a poet by the name of Thomas Gray that reading Aristotle is like eating dried hay. And there is a whole series of people who criticize the way he presents his philosophy. I'll just read this very quickly. Somebody named Montgomery Firth echoes the sentiment. Aristotle's text, he says, is terse and elliptical, like reading a cipher. For this reason, he reports, most translators feel obliged to interpolate. And here come the ambulances right as I'm reading this here. Maybe that's appropriate for this part of reading about Aristotle, but in other words, the meaning of the text is rarely transparent or helpfully explicated, and translators regularly attempt to explain it to their readers, and that they argue that the text itself is not written in good prose, and that no translation can simultaneously attain the aim of being literal and also being good English. And there's lots of different criticisms, apparently, of Aristotle's methods of presentation out there. And not only necessarily his methods, but as we go into in the chapter, they specifically criticize, I think, what is probably termed as the sort of essences theory that Aristotle would have. Leontium makes the point that qualities such as the color yellow do not exist apart from the matter in which they're associated. And so there's a lot of this, which I'm not going to be able to unwind in this opening section, is sort of a criticism of the whole issue, is a criticism of theory. What Leontium tries to explain in detail here is that the worst thing you can do is to come up with a theory of something and hold to that theory regardless of the facts and the evidence that may or may not support it. And there's a lot of discussion in here. Frances Wright alleges that really philosophy should be considered mostly to be observation, and that when you leave your emphasis on observation and you start concluding global theories about the meaning of things, you really are in very dangerous territory, and you basically should not do that. Now, that's an extremely deep subject. I think I'll leave the depth of that for our discussion, but a lot of the chapter targeted at that issue. Frances Wright is alleging that Epicurus is really just focused on observing nature and tracing causes and effects by observing the relationships of things, but not ever thinking that he can derive a first cause from his observations. And it's this process of intellectually deriving a cause from this effect that is really a lot of what Leontium and Frances Wright are criticizing here. Gosh, that's probably a summary of the major topics that are discussed in the chapter, but it's woefully insufficient to really go into the detail. And we're not going to focus on this aspect tonight in terms of and Scott was very good last week about pointing out that the issue is we're not really necessarily concerned with how faithful this is to Epicurus other than sort of as a historical aspect of it. It's hard for me to say how much of this is pure Epicurus and how much of this is the Benthamite anachronisms, as Kevin was pointing out last week. It strikes me that this is stronger in terms of never reaching a conclusion than Epicurus would be himself. It seems a little bit stronger skepticism, perhaps, than I read into Epicurus. But at any rate, it is a pretty strong introduction into the idea of materialism. And of course, they discuss that here in the chapter too, that they discuss whether matter, whether intelligence and life is a property of matter in the same way that I think it's fair to say that they assert here that just as yellow or color can be a quality of matter, she is taking the position that life itself can be a quality of matter, and that it really doesn't mean anything to just say that matter is inert unless you really start unpacking the ideas of what you mean by inert versus living. A lot of deep material in that I think is just generally a sort of description of materialism, not in the money sense, but in matter and void, atomic sense. So Joshua,
might I say one thing real quick?
Yes, absolutely.
Just in comment to something that you said, I wanted to clear the record on something. I did say last time something to the effect of, at the end of the day, understanding whether a particular fine point of philosophy was exactly what Epicurus said, or it wasn't, but it's a good piece of philosophy. At the end of the day, we're all, as human beings, concerned somewhat primarily with having the best philosophy, with the best understanding of the world and our lives and so forth, and something that directs us, rather than the pedantry of a fine point in Epicureanism. Right. But I don't mean, sorry to turn that around. I don't mean to leave everybody thinking that I don't see any value in attempting to properly understand Epicurus and Epicureanism. Obviously, we're here all to do that as well. I just wanted to kind of say that. I don't want to kind of like diss that whole thing like that's not important. We do want to try to ferret out exactly what is strictly that we can be sure of as reasonably possible with what is Epicureanism and what is not, and so forth. But we don't want to also, completely let go or divorce ourselves from, what this means to us and the value that Frances Wright might be bringing to us by, bringing up her perspective on this stuff. So I just wanted to kind of throw something like that out there.
Yeah, that's no problem at all. That just reminds us of basically the structure of what we're doing here. It's sort of a friendly book review. And maybe, again, one of my original goals of all this is sort of to go through this once and perhaps have a sort of prototype here where I would hope as the years go by, there'll be a greater interest in Epicurus, and this may be one way in which people locally or who are in a particular group setting might take a book like this and read it. And it's always a matter of applying things and making real world use out of it. Pedantry, like you're saying there, Scott, knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Epicurus is very clear that knowledge for the sake of knowledge is not something that he agrees with. Once you conclude that living happily is the goal of life, then knowledge for the sake of knowledge is like virtue for the sake of virtue. If it doesn't bring happiness and pleasure to the people who are participating in it, it's ultimately a waste of time. So if we don't learn that lesson, that knowledge for the sake of knowledge is useless, then we're missing a very basic lesson of Epicurus. So, okay, having made that point, now we turn to Joshua, right? Joshua?
Yeah, absolutely. I did manage to skim to the end. The thing that most struck me about so much in this chapter is all this question of morality and how it sort of impinges on questions of inquiry into nature. And so we started last week, I think, with sort of this presumption on Theon's part that just to question the existence of the gods was something akin to a thought crime. And you get a little bit of that as well in this chapter. And then I think what Frances Wright, though, is clearly laying out here is not really a moral case as Epicurus would have understood it, but she is showing a large dose of utilitarianism here. And I got two quotes in particular to sort of draw that out. It says, first, it cannot be a moral truth since it is not deduced from the consequences of human action. That strikes me as being, we've been saying Benthamite, but incredibly consequentialist in terms of ethics or utilitarian. And then in the very end, when Frances Wright has this strange section in italics, note by the translator, he says, if we look to our mental philosophy, to what has our scrutiny led but to the leading principles of Epicurean ethics in the pleasure, utility, propriety of human action, whatever word we employ. I think it is quite important what word we do employ. So to just kind of slip that in there seemed to me, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. Like you were just saying, it's at a certain point, we just want to read the book and get what we can out of it. But it's clear to me that what she's portraying here as his ethics does not necessarily line up with what he had to say, much like how occasionally I can't even think of the word now, epistemology, there we go, how the epistemology doesn't quite match up either. Other than that, I won't drone on too long because, as I say, I didn't really spend a whole lot of time.
Yeah, well, let's go ahead and move to Kevin if you're able to comment on that aspect of things, Kevin. What are you thinking about? Is this her being Benthamite again, or is it a logical extension of what we do know about Epicurus? Because I'm kind of in the middle on that.
I was just about to say I can't really answer. I can see a lot of what at least I know about Epicurus here in the empiricism in not going beyond observation. I also see a lot of David Hume and Bentham and Mill in their empiricism and philosophy of science through here, right? There are passages through here that just sort of follow the same structure that David Hume uses in the treatise and the inquiries to explain why you can't go beyond observation. You can't, what are the bits? You can't interpret a cause beyond what you can see.
That is specifically in what, Kevin?
In David Hume, in the inquiry concerning human understanding.
Okay.
And
that's interesting.
The part you were just talking about, that where she's raising all these points about how moral conclusions can only be drawn from the actions of men, not from a brute fact, is also part of Hume and, well, less Mill, but certainly Hume's way of doing morality. Right? There's nothing moral in the empirical physical world. We have to interpret it as moral or immoral based on whether it causes us benefit or pain.
I don't necessarily see that as inconsistent with Epicurus.
No.
There's always that dual issue of whether it's consistent or inconsistent with Epicurus, and also whether it's also we think it makes sense or not. Do we think it makes sense?
I also took a bit of the translator's note to be a kind of acknowledgement that she was reading in some Hume and some Bentham and Mill into Epicurus. There are little bits through there that made it sound like we now understand things a little better, right? The bits about, yellow and measure and primary and secondary qualities, whether they're in objects or not, right? That we don't, the bit about Aristotle at the beginning is great. He is horrible to read. The joke I always learned on Aristotle is we have the notes of a B- student.
That's what walked me out of philosophy, by the way. I'll just say this. In my third year of majoring in philosophy in an Aristotle class, I'm like, this is it. This is baloney. This is so pedantic. It is so difficult to understand. It's so, philosophical. It's just so ivory tower. And I'm like, I've had it with this. This stuff doesn't make sense. It can't reach the common person and blah, blah, blah. It was Aristotle who did that to me. I didn't realize all of this at the time, but what you're saying, makes perfect sense.
They say Aristotle wrote dialogues like Plato did, but none of them survived. That what survived is the texts that went through the schools rather than the stuff that was meant for public consumption. But either way, the claim here from Aristotle that we can know the hidden natures of things and their purpose and their function and their goal. Epicurus certainly disagreed with that in Aristotle, and pretty much everyone else has since, right? That from observation, we can't go and assume that there's a purpose. We can't assume that there's a final end or a designer or anything. That stuff struck me as authentic from Epicurus, and then the rest of it was a blend of that starting point with some later thoughts about how science progresses, if it does, and Hume's thoughts about empiricism, right? But all to the same point, we can't get any moral knowledge from observing the world. What we can get is some things hurt and some things don't. Some things are beneficial in the long run and some things aren't. And that's
here's one. Go ahead, Kevin.
No, I was just muttering at that point.
Okay. One of the lines in the middle of this long discourse that has always stuck with me, when she starts talking about what philosophy should do, she says, philosophy receives no truths until she's tested them by experience. She advances no opinions unsupported by the testimony of facts, and she acknowledges no virtue, but that's involved in beneficial actions, no vice, but that's involved in actions hurtful in ourselves and to others. That far, I've always thought was pretty consistent with Epicurus, but the very next sentence, above all, she advances no dogmas. She is slow to assert what is, and she calls nothing impossible. When you say that you can call nothing impossible, that's always struck me as so close to just in sort of an absolute skepticism position that I don't really read that in Epicurus's tone direction. It seems to me that there are certain things that he considers to be very possible and certain things he considers to be impossible. And so if you take her explanation here, as far as she seems to go with it, I think that's further than either I think Epicurus would have gone or that I think myself makes sense. And I know we don't have this in front of us, but there is in that later collection of essay, an essay that she wrote on basically epistemology. And Frances Wright herself seems to have taken this position to the point where she basically said in this essay that I don't really care about the size of the universe. I don't care how old the universe is. I don't care about any of these physics issues. All I'm really concerned about is how to live my life, which again is sort of a logical extension of certain aspects of Epicurus's position. But at the same time, he was very interested in the physics and cosmology as well. So that gets back to what we were talking about last week in terms of whether most people are satisfied to not take a position on certain unanswerable questions like that. They want to take a position, it seems like, and they're very nervous if they don't have a position they think is the most reasonable one. She, again, seems to be one of these people more comfortable with just saying, I don't know, and I'm going to leave it there.
That seems much more skeptical than Epicurean. Right? There seem to be things Epicurus thought you needed to know if you were going to live free from anxiety and free from the fear of death, right? You had to believe certain things about what we're reading now, about the nature of the universe, right? Part of what gets you over the fear of death is recognizing we are just atoms in the void. If that's up in the air in a skeptical way, I'm suddenly much more afraid.
At least that was Epicurus' position there. Now, I'm not sure that it's not Pyrrho's position, maybe, and or I don't know which version of that Scott might say is.
It's not exactly Scott's either. I did talk a little bit about that last time.
Yes,
And my to try to put it really briefly, this sharp distinction between I'm skeptical and I can't, epistemologically, I don't accept anything as known truth, or I'm dogmatic. There's a lot between those two. I, for instance, do not, I'm basically pretty skeptical. I have to put a disclaimer on almost anything. There's no truth that I cannot 100% lock down, except perhaps that I seem to be experiencing things. It's probably, it's kind of Descartes, right? Meditations of First Philosophy, almost there. So there's nothing that I can really nail down. And yet, even though I still recognize that it's possible to think, pretty much I haven't seen evidence for there being supernatural beings, or for anybody, if there are any of them, for anybody really having the right knowledge about them and so forth. And the afterlife, I haven't seen any, evidence that convinces me that such a thing exists and so forth. I feel very confident, right with my skeptical attitude, that nonetheless, I'm not worried about death. I feel pretty confident that there's not a heaven or hell with these horrible and wonderful beings and so forth. It just seems to me silly stuff that human beings make up. It's our nature to make such stories and this up, and that's wonderful. But I'm not convinced by them. I'm not worried about death. And yet I have to write my little disclaimer down at the bottom of the page and say, I can't know for sure. It just seems like ridiculously unlikely that there's actually 12 green beings that float around and have created the earth and they're going to be judging it or whatever and stop this stuff. So
Well,
I wanted to say that there's some space in between. Sorry, go ahead, Josh.
I was going to say, sort of in defense of David Hume, I think that his skepticism was along those same lines. He's got to work on miracles, in which he basically rejects the entire premise of miracles. So he's not a purist in the sense of saying, well, I don't know this for sure. It's not possible to know anything for sure. Therefore, it's all equally likely to be true.
Yeah, it's a big jump.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There's a lot of gray area in between there that we actually work with as human beings. And Epicurus seems to, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that David Hume was born something like 17 years after the last person, the last quote unquote unbeliever was killed in Scotland for his unbelief. So his skepticism is also quite courageous for its time. But
he was also never able to get a university position because of it.
Right. And when John Locke wrote his paper in support of free speech and freedom of religion, he wrote it in Latin and published it anonymously in the Netherlands. So
that was someone who needed tenure. But yeah, that's completely Hume's view, and I see that running through a lot of this here, but it's not inconsistent with Epicurus, except insofar as Hume is more comfortable with skepticism than I ever thought Epicurus would be.
I'm glad you clarified that, because I thought I heard at one time you were saying that really, Wright's off course. She's doing Hume now. She's not doing Epicurus. But really, yeah, you're saying that no, they're pretty similar in a lot of ways, a lot of stuff. So there's not a complete contradiction here going on.
Why don't we talk about one of the phrases that pops out at me that an audience of less advanced philosophers might pick up on, is this discussion of self-evident truth, and how she takes the position that there basically are no self-evident truths, especially in terms of moral truths, which would be interesting to consider how that factors into Thomas Jefferson's holding certain truths to be self-evident. Where do we come down on self-evident truth?
How do you ask that question? Do you want us to answer what we think?
Well,
probably not.
At least starting off with, it looks like Frances Wright is taking the position that there are no self-evident truths, especially in the moral realm, and that basically any truth is just simply dependent upon the evidence that supports it, which, as long as that evidence is there, then something's true. If the evidence goes away, then it's not true. But the whole issue of self-evident truth has been troublesome.
But I mean, certainly Epicurus, I'll throw this out here and see what everybody thinks. I mean, Epicurus considered there to be self-evident truths, right? Because there was enough evidence to say, okay, this seems to be the case. We can't really deny this and continue on with life, right?
I don't know about that. Joshua and Kevin, what do you think about what was Epicurus's position on self-evident truth? Did he agree or disagree with it?
Well, certain things, if you're going to hold, for example, that the senses are essentially perfect, and that they perfectly represent what they're witnessing, and that the only error comes in from the mind and from certain assumptions that are made after the senses report the information to you, that would be, I think, a kind of self-evident truth. I mean, the evidence for the thing is the thing that is evident to your eyes, right?
Sugar is sweet.
Right.
Is sugar being sweet a self-evident truth?
See, it's the word truth for me that I don't like.
Yeah.
She goes on here to say that a truth is an ascertained fact, in which case I would prefer to stick with the word fact. But and then to move from self-evident truth in physics to self-evident moral truths is even more of a leap in my view. And this is where she says, it cannot be a moral truth since it is not deduced from the consequences of human action. So in that case, if it were deduced from the consequences of human action, would it then be a moral truth? And that's where I don't know that Epicurus would go along with that. Because what Epicurus says is true, or not truth. He says that that ethics or justice exists by human convention.
Mhm.
And that if you have a tribe that, maybe two tribes that haven't developed convention or haven't gotten that far in their development maybe, then it would be difficult to make moral claims about their action. Have I represented that fairly, Cassius?
I'll have to say, I'm not sure. Say it one more time.
Well, he says, I think he specifically says, like, among brute beasts, there's no morality among brute beasts.
Right.
Because and the reason there's no morality is not because they don't kill each other. They do that every day.
Or he says there's no justice. Now, is justice?
Yeah, I know, and I constantly conflate the issue of justice and ethics. I guess it's difficult to get a handle on what the ethics would be in regards to interpersonal relations if it doesn't come down to a census. But
well, Kevin hasn't put in his opinion on, is sugar being sweet a self-evident truth?
No, but it's a truth, I think, for Epicurus, right? It's not something we know by reason, but only by experience. And I agree with everything Joshua was saying, right? There are certain things we just get right because Epicurus believes at core our senses are perfect, that there are things we just get right. We're not mistaken about it. But a self-evident truth is the sort of thing, if you think about it, it becomes true. For Epicurus, It all has to be experienced. That's how I read it anyway, right? A self-evident truth is a truth of logic. And a lot of ethicists will say moral truths are self-evident. It's just obvious if you think about human nature. And I don't find that in Epicurus. It has to be experienced, right? We can know for Epicurus what it is to be human, but that doesn't tell us any truths about it except that it experiences pleasure and pain, right? I don't get the leap to principle and purpose in Epicurus.
Here's my thing. I don't think that people use the word self-evident truth to describe just plain facts.
No, I don't.
The phrase self-evident truth is a mechanism to get from something we know to be true to something we don't know to be true, but want to be true.
Yeah, that's right. Right.
That's what I took Wright's argument to be through here, that it's wish fulfillment. When you don't have a good argument for something, you say it's obvious.
Right. I've been guilty of that myself, I'm sure. But
well, is it a self-evident? I mean, what self-evident truths do we have? Isn't it the case that if I taste something and to me it tastes sweet, whatever that exact word means, that is a self-evident truth? It doesn't. What's being described here doesn't seem right to me. That self-evidence means that I've got to have some sort of reasoning or something behind it. I taste this stuff; it's self-evident. There's no arguing about it. It's sweet. No, is that not what self-evident truth is?
Yeah, I'm pretty close to that position, Scott. Looking further down in this text, some of it may be answered by this paragraph that says the existence of all that we see and hear and feel is demonstrated to our senses, and the belief we yield to this existence is immediate and irresistible, that is intuitive. And so that seems to be what she's considering to be a potentially self-evident. But then she distinguishes the existence of the creating cause that you speak of is not demonstrated to our senses, and therefore the belief in it cannot be immediate and irresistible. So maybe she's focusing on this issue of whether it's irresistible or not as to whether it is self-evident. I guess the senses, snow being white and sugar being sweet, are irresistible to our senses, but something that you have to, as Kevin was saying, think about or use logic about, connect, is just beyond the scope of the senses proving it to you. And there's something else involved.
Well, oddly enough, Leontian gives a few examples of what she considers to be self-evident truths.
Okay, go ahead.
And she says, for instance, that a whole is greater than its parts, which I guess depending on how you look at that two are more than one. I mean, these are, in essence, logical claims that we're making here, right?
That would be, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And I wonder if we've become Aristotelian pedants now. Because my first thought is, well, there are things we know by experience, and that's everything Scott was saying. And for Epicurus, we can be certain of them. We get it right. It accurately reflects reality. But that's not a self-evident truth. That's an experiential truth. And at some point, it's sort of funny. We've fallen into an Aristotle lecture of putting everything in its little box.
Right.
The important part is everything we've listed here whatever we want to call it, isn't giving us the kind of moral truths or general principles, or certainly not giving us any reason to believe that there's a designer and creator, or even that we have any knowledge of what might have caused the sugar to make us taste sweet, right? That it does is obvious every time we do it. Why it does is something we'll never be able to figure out.
Well, that seems to be her ultimate
The
point.
experience of sweetness, though, is something that's unique to me. You can have somebody else taste sugar and it doesn't taste sweet. They don't like it. It's horrible. That can very much be the case. Okay. What I'm suggesting here is that there's not something that is really outside of me or my experience of it that I'm talking about is true. It's my experience itself per se is self-evident to me. It tastes a certain way. Okay, that doesn't mean that sugar is a certain way. That's different, and that requires reasoning. I might, for instance, say, well, let me have a whole bunch of people taste this stuff, and what do we all think about it? I like it, I like it, I like it, I don't like it. We start to use reason to determine what we do with that self-evident truth. The self-evident truth to me means its evidence is just right there with it. There's nothing I need to think about or rationalize about. It has a certain experience when I encounter it. Am I off track in describing it that way?
Well, next week we'll do
so.
the Pepsi challenge on the evening discussion, and we'll figure out the answer to that question.
Actually, they sell a little pill that inverts your tastes.
Oh, yeah.
Really?
So bitter
Great.
things taste sweet, and that's always a fun day in class.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm oh God, you can edit me out if it's pedantic, but what you're describing, Scott, is almost always called just a natural force, right? Or the
natural force.
Hume calls it the force of nature, where you just have to you're compelled to believe that what you're experiencing is real. It just happens to you without any rational input or judgment.
Well, I can accept the last part, but not the first part. What happens to me is not real. It's just what happens to me. It is an experience. That's it. Okay. I can't say,
that it's your experience is what's happening to you, right? That, I mean, for all I know, your taste of sweet is radically different than what I'm subjectively experiencing.
Yes.
Right. But that what I'm experiencing and what you're experiencing are happening, and we can't help but believe it, is a sort of natural force that occurs in us.
Different terminology. That's what I call self-evident truth, but okay.
And I think self-evident is used for more the logic and reason that if you think about it.
For me, it's not. I've never heard it that way. I didn't know that. Okay.
I don't know if I'm right. I just know that's the way Hume and Descartes and Mill use it.
Okay. Yeah. For me, self-evidence means no thinking whatsoever. Boom. Experience. This is self-evident. I feel an experience. That's happening. There's no debate in my mind about it or anything. I can't initially make any further claims about that experience, but it happens. It's self-evident. There's no thinking I need really to do much about it. In fact, once I do start thinking, I'm moved away from self-evidence.
The examples Aristotle gives are things you have to think about before they become self-evident.
Weird.
Exactly.
I don't remember that.
At risk of driving you from this the way Aristotle goes. I'll probably just shut up now. But Aristotle's example is equals added to equals yield equal. And until you ponder through what that means, it's not evident.
Mm-hmm.
And
okay. Well, this gets kind of to be a semantic argument, whether it's the force of nature you're talking about, or we don't want to go there too much. We want to say, well, what's the content we really want to go after here?
Yeah, getting back to where she's going, where is she going with this argument? What is she attempting to use it? Because I see a lot of commonality between her position and a lot of what I hear Scott saying as well. But regardless of who's right, who's wrong, where is she going? And it seems like to me that she's in hammering against self-evident truth, at least in the moral sphere. She really ends up basically, after she says, I don't care if I saw it get light every day after some horse rides through the sky, I would think that it was the horse that brought the light instead of the sun. So I'm going to radically follow my observations and follow whatever they tell me without trying to make up a theory that conflicts with them. And where she takes that appears to, that's where we go into this issue of the word inert. And she brings it back to materialism. And it looks like to me where she's ending up with the argument is Theon says all matter surely is inert in itself. But then Leontium replies, all matter surely is in itself as it is. I'm sorry, says Metrodorus with a smile. And I would say that it's living and active. And it's because it's so they get into a debate about, this is where they reduce it sort of to materialism. I guess there's a connection between rejecting causes and theories beyond what you can observe, and there's a connection there in reaching the conclusion that basically you just have to go with what's in front of you, what's detectable through your senses, which are the material things that you can observe. And he includes the life as being one of those things that's in front of you. That life, we don't know how many existences life is inherent is, she says. We find it in vegetables. We might even perceive it in stones if we could watch them form. And until you discover some substance which undergoes no change, you can't really just consider matter to be inert. It is what it is, basically. And Theon says that the classing of thought and life among the qualities of matter is new to me. I perceive that that's where she's been going with the whole argument up to that point, is that rather than tracing everything back to a first cause, she's getting him acclimated to just observing what is and not investing in human life anything outside of just the material aspects of it. I've said a lot there. Somebody help me out. Is that where she's going, or do you see her going somewhere else? What is in a substance cannot be separate from it, and it's not a matter or compound of qualities. And to conceive a mind independent of matter is as if we could conceive of color independent of the substance colored. And that's where she says that the error of conceiving a quality in the abstract often offended me in the Lyceum, said Theon, but I never considered the error as extending to mind and life any more than to vice and virtue. Is that the ultimate conclusion of this argument?
I thought so. And I understood it just the way you explained it, right? For the materialism to work, you have to explain how we're conscious and active if we're basically just complicated rocks. And I hadn't noticed what you just read till you read it out loud, but that sounds so much like Descartes, who says, I can imagine myself thinking without my body. I can imagine thought without the material stuff. So there has to be purely inert matter and then the soul. And that's how he goes on to prove God exists. One of the ways. He's got like 9 ways he proves exists. Yeah. All of them bad. But or all satisfactory to him. But the idea that matter is completely inert with nothing, with no, for the Aristotelian term, principle of internal motion, which doesn't do anything but sit there, and only mind can cause it to do something. Descartes arrives at that by pure speculation and reason. And so if the response here is from Wright that no, you watch things, watch this rock long enough, you might think it's alive too, is really kind of brilliant and perfectly Epicurean, right?
Perfectly Epicurean, yes.
Well,
I mean, how many people really subscribe to? Do we? I mean, I don't subscribe to that at all. Am I alone on this?
Alone in what?
That what?
In thinking that
Scott,
in thinking that this mind and all these intangible things must be inherent, must be in the matter somewhere, somehow. It comes from there. Well, those words are kind of, that language is clumsy because it's really kind of describing things using a metaphor from the physical world. Okay, to me, it seems obvious that there is not some sort of mind contained within the matter that's then revealed, but rather that mind is an epiphenomena that comes to exist when matter and energy are combined in certain ways.
Well, Scott, you and 5 or 6 other Epicureans may think that, but the rest of the world invested in sort of monotheism and the spiritual realm and so forth thinks that it's obvious that these things cannot be inherent in dirt. So I guess you're confessing your closeness to some Epicurean principles there, I would say.
I was wondering whether I was expressing an Epicurean perspective or not.
Yeah,
I think you are. Yes, I think you are.
Yeah.
Okay.
But apparently that's the root of a lot of this. In my own weak understanding of things, I've understood Aristotle as asserting that there are essences, that yellow, there is some kind of an essence of yellow that is within things that are yellow. There's not necessarily yellow in some other universe like a Platonic form might describe, but it's my understanding, and Kevin, please correct me and make this more accurate. My understanding, Plato put these forms in some other dimension, such as yellow. There's a perfect yellow in another dimension, and that Aristotle rejected this other dimension stuff, but said that yellow objects have some essence of yellow in them. And then Epicurus has taken the position that there is no other dimension, Plato. There is no essence, Aristotle. Yellow is an emergent quality. of
Yeah.
atoms in a particular configuration at a particular time. How far off the beam am I in summarizing it that way?
If you're wrong, I'm wrong, right?
Okay.
Well, it sounds good to me.
Yeah, I mean, because I mean that's
I'm
exactly
pretty-
what Aristotle says, right? There is yellow in the yellow thing that we sense, and Plato's like, no, whatever's in the thing we don't know about, but there's a perfect form of yellow in the realm of the forms, right? And Epicurus does say there is no essence. There's temporary conglomeration of atoms, some of them self-replicating, but there's no form they're matching onto. There is nothing but what is that we can observe.
I expressed it that way, Kevin, because there's in my reading there seems to be just a universal consensus that Plato is talking about these forms in another dimension. But I don't have my own personal reference to where Aristotle is saying that there is an essence of yellow inside of yellow things. Would you know where that is? And maybe even discuss that in an earlier.
It's in the first couple books of the Metaphysics.
In metaphysics,
everything is made up of form and matter, but neither can exist without the other outside of an individual. And so the form of yellow things, there's an accidental form of yellow in all things that are yellow. There's a substantial form for rabbit in all rabbits. And that defines what the thing is, but it doesn't exist apart from any existing rabbits, right? If you kill all the rabbits, there is no more form of rabbit.
Okay. Apparently, Scott got several years in philosophy class. I've only gotten through a couple of chapters of Nicomachean Ethics, and I don't have any metaphysics reading. So that's good to know where to look.
Scott's right. You're not missing much. But that's also how Aristotle says once, everything that Plato puts in the magic mystical form, Aristotle says we can experience through the senses, and we can sense. When you see a rabbit, you can determine its function and its purpose and its meaning in the universe and all the moral rules that would apply to it. That somehow that's there to be had by sensation because the form is in the rabbit. And I take Epicurus to be saying, no, that's a temporary conglomeration of atoms that we can identify as a rabbit. And without all the other stuff that Aristotle is able to infer, right? I think Wright is right here. Sorry. Aristotle says,
right.
Epicurus says, no, we can't go beyond what we can immediately experience. It just doesn't work.
Yeah. My addition to that or comment would be that I think Epicurus would be very firm that I'm now going to turn into a cow. The rabbit is a formation of atoms about which we can observe and reach a lot of conclusions and make a lot of predictions. We can base a happy life on the idea that we can learn about things and predict the future based on our knowledge of atoms and so forth. And so he's not saying that this rabbit could disappear any second. He's erecting a structure of science that allows you to work and structure your life so that you can hope to be happy, because most of the world does operate. This is the part about the determinism. When you get into the physics of how worlds are formed, this passage about how most things do operate in a manner in terms of the motions of atoms and so forth. It's only when you've got free will there, but in general, the sun does come up in the east every day, and it does set in the west every day, and the rabbit is going to be a rabbit, but it's because of the atomic makeup of it, and not because of a platonic form of a rabbit or an essence of a rabbit within inside of it. So
that's what I liked about right here. The asking why and looking for that answer is just fruitless. And then taking some moral conclusion based off your answer to those questions is even worse.
Right. Yeah, she's really continues to hit this issue about facts and the separation of facts versus morality, and coming up with moral conclusions that are not the same. And then that's where she ends off into this notes by the translator, which once again, this notes by the translator seems to me awfully more like a 60-year-old professor would have written about one of his colleagues than a 20-year-old would have written about Thomas Browne of Edinburgh. The late, amiable, and enlightened Thomas Browne of Edinburgh is such a wonderful job of elaborating a system that was essentially Epicurean. Joshua?
Well, I'll tell you what I'm worried about, and it's this horse made of sunlight galloping across the horizon every morning.
Tell us about that.
Yep, that's the phrase that becomes internet famous.
Yeah. Here's why I'm worried about it. Because what I think it's I don't even have the book open anymore, but I think it was Leontian who said that if she saw the horse running across the horizon every morning and then the light came up, she might infer that the horse was the cause of the light. I think this doesn't quite give the early Epicureans their due. We got that quote in Lucian about this sort of charlatan oracle monger, in which he says, even if Epicurus even if he didn't know what the precise imposture was, he could have detected that there was an imposture. And this is something that happens when you just have a broad base of knowledge from which to analyze sensory input. And what it instantly reminded me of is after World War II, in these Pacific islands, you had, for a long time during the war, you had planes and ships showing up and bringing food and clothing and shelters and munitions and all this new stuff that they didn't have on the island before that. And then the war ended and gradually all this stuff just went away. And the landing strips were still there, but the planes stopped coming. And the docks and jetties were still there, but the boats stopped coming. And so what they started to do, these islanders, was they started building out of bamboo and trees and grass. They started building their own airstrips and their own planes and their own air traffic control towers and their own docks and their own jetties, expecting by mimesis that if they just built the infrastructure on the ground out of stuff they had lying around, the planes would come and they would bring the food and they would bring the shelter and all this. And even to this day, it's really quite tragic, but you've got the John Frum cult. People who are, it's presumed that maybe John Frum was an American or a Canadian or an Australian soldier or aviator or sailor. And to this day, people are still awaiting his coming to bring them cargo. And it's all based on a misapprehension of the relationship between airplane runways and the arrival of airplanes. And so I don't think it's enough just to assume a cause when you have an effect. I think it takes a little bit more than that. And a dose of skepticism is precisely what I think Lucian would have applied to the situation. I think Lucretius has several moments when he says, it's not always the first and most obvious thing. There's very often an explanation which you haven't thought of, or maybe you have thought of, but you couldn't prove, that turns out to be a better explanation for the given facts. And so I've just been thinking about that this entire time because it really does pose quite an interesting problem.
Well, Frances Wright, I presume she's kind of reducing it to the absurd by making an argument like that. I guess if you actually could see a horse flying through the sky, it'd be a very special kind of horse. So maybe there'd be something about it that use your skeptical bent to decide whether it was an imposture or not. She seems to just want to hit extremely hard that there's no limit to this point, that you're going to rest on observation and you're going to realize that every time you go back one more level, there's still another cause before that, and that you're never going to reach a first cause. So it doesn't really even make sense to set out in that direction unless you've got a more practical reason to.
This is the part that reminded me so much of Hume, because all he says is we just know that the sequence of events. We don't know what's causing what, right? I also was thinking what you were just saying. If we saw a horse dragging the sun, or a horse came up and then the sun came up, and we saw it every day, it wouldn't be outstanding, right? We wouldn't think this needs any explanation. It's just what's there, and we would infer the one thing is causing the other because the one thing happened first. And this is the part she's borrowing from you, where he says we can't understand the causes of anything, but we can habitually learn that one thing follows another, and we just assume there's some connection between there, but we can never figure out why. Right. Hume's line on this is the best natural philosophy just shows us more of what we're ignorant of. And I really got that thread running through this section of the chapter. Our empirical observation can tell us what's there, but not get beyond it, and certainly not infer what could have caused it to be there.
That's Hume, you're saying?
Yeah. Yeah. And I saw that running through much of this.
It's running through this, what Wright is saying right now?
Yeah.
And what's your feel on how Epicurean is that, really? How true is that to Epicurus?
I don't know, right? Because Epicurus has this kind of sensory cognition that just gets it right. But all we get is what we observe anyway, and inferring some kind of purpose or creator or function to it is just a leap of bad reason for Epicurus as well. I think Hume's explanation of why that's bad reason is probably different from Epicurus, but Epicurus would agree that it's bad reasoning.
Maybe this is why she has Leontium say this as opposed to having Epicurus himself in it, that she recognizes a little bit of leeway between what she's saying and what Epicurus's position actually was. But I don't really think it's that far off.
No, I don't think it is either. Right? It's what it struck me as a little bit like Scott a little while ago talking about mind being an epiphenomenon on matter, right? It's a way of describing it that certainly wasn't available to Epicurus, but I'm not sure if he understood what we're talking about, he'd disagree. And so I'm not sure Epicurus would disagree with what's said here. It's just a slightly different understanding of what we're observing and how we're putting it together.
And of course, what is in the Epicurean text is a lot of discussion about just the weight of evidence and how you're going to weigh particular evidence. It seems to me like in the way that Frances Wright is tracing it, we are really at a fairly high level abstract argument. It seems to me that Epicurus would always kind of go back to, well, let's just discuss what evidence you've really got to deal. And so his attacking of whether there's a first cause or a supernatural creator over the universe generally seemed to be from a more practical point than this kind of a high level sort of logical argument. I don't think he would necessarily have dismissed it out of hand. I think he would be concerned about radical skepticism taking over too far if you take this to a real extreme. But pointing out that going back further and further and further, you've just always got to have another explanation. I don't think he's uncomfortable with that argument. Well, we're at about an hour for tonight, and next week is the tour de force against religion to bring the book to a close. What else for tonight?
I have one sentence I'm trying to wrap my head around here. In philosophy, theory and hypothesis are worse than nothing. I know this touches on so much of what we've already been talking about, but for some reason, I'm just struggling to get to the heart of it or trying to figure out really whether I actually agree with what's being said here. Granted,
I think that's what goes too far.
The assumption here is that, but even in her time, you had this for a long time, philosophy and natural philosophy, or what we would call today simply physical science, operated under more or less the same heading. And so from that point of view, hypothesis seems to be absolutely crucial. But if you're talking about, the natural sciences spinning off and doing their own thing, and they've got their own method to govern that procedure, now we're just talking about philosophy as in the realms of epistemology and metaphysics and politics and ethics and aesthetics and that kind of thing. Is it still the case that in philosophy, theory and hypothesis are worse than nothing? I don't have an answer. I'm just reading out the question. But something to think about.
Yeah, I
That
don't.
It has always struck me as being overbroad for Epicurus's positions, treated like that. But there's certainly a way to interpret it. If you take that so far, I think that you end up out of bounds from where most people are going to be comfortable in life. Apparently, some people are more comfortable with radical skepticism and don't want to reach any conclusion about anything. They just want to say, I observed this and this is the way it is now. And tomorrow it may be different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when Joshua reads that so strongly, that is Pyrrhonian skepticism.
Sometimes I wonder how different all these positions are on epistemology when it comes right down to it. That may sound crazy, but at the end of the day, it seems like everybody to some extent says, well, I can't know, anything much really hardcore for sure, but it seems to me things work like this. So I'm going to just move ahead on this basis until I learn something different. Now, that's really kind of a silly maybe example, but I mean, in a way, that's kind of, I keep hearing that again from all these different positions. Is that occurring to anybody else, or no, these are radically different? I mean, I get that there's a difference, but you know what I'm saying? I mean, it sounds like they're just fluctuations of the same thing. I could say of myself that I am a radical skeptic. There's a degree to which that is absolutely true. I can't, really say much of anything that I can feel like, okay, this is absolutely truth, because I can't 100% trust my senses, blah, blah, blah. I'm a skeptic. On the other hand, I'm not a skeptic, because I move forward with believing that, I have a physical body, the physical reality appears to be here. I realize it's possible I could be in a dream, but I don't think so. It seems like there's a lot of evidence pointing towards what's going on is an approximation pretty much of what I understand, and science is helping me understand that. That's the same Scott, same one, talking from two different perspectives. On the one hand, I'm a materialist and this is the world that I live in and it's real. And on the other hand, no, I can't know anything. And all these, different languages and positions between, to me, sound, more similar than they are different in some ways. It's almost like a matter of emphasis or thing. I don't know. That's just a feeling that I get from all of it. Everybody's got their little disclaimer at the bottom of the page.
I'm tempted to play the cynic and just say, oh, you're an academic skeptic now.
But I don't think that you would really find me to be so.
Probably not across the board. It's just that's what I heard you describing right now. You'll go with what seems likely without being too committed to it. And I have the same take. I mean, I think a lot of these schools fought most viciously with each other because you always fight with someone who's close. Like they're the ones who understand you the best and get that tiny little bit wrong.
Well, it's getting too late probably to defend that I'm not an academic skeptic, but maybe that would be a fun one to try to go after sometime.
I was just poking you with a stick. I couldn't resist.
And that's good. And I want that's poke, man, because that's where we start really getting into some fun stuff. But we're 10 after, so we probably have to.
One thing I'd just like to say as my sort of closing thought is that it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that most of what's going on in ancient Greek, in terms of ancient Greece, I should say, in terms of the pre-Socratic philosophers and the Athenians, and everything that's going on here is sort of the first bad idea that someone was able to come up with. Because before that, you just had theology. You just had,
mystical world.
You have to pray to Poseidon before you sail onto the Aegean, because otherwise he's going to send you to the bottom of the sea. And so many of these ideas, while they seem so terrible to us, at least to me, some of these ideas, it's almost like how could someone have thought that motion was impossible, as we talked about in the podcast last week. Even though it sounds like a terrible idea, it was sort of the first bad idea compared to what came before it, which was not having any idea at all. So there is a sense of development, at least in the progression.
Okay, well, this is probably a good time to cap it for tonight. We'll come back next week. And in the meantime, I guess this is the time to say goodnight. So,
yes.
Good night. Bye.